About 9 months ago, when we were going through the Brexit debates, I said to my kids, now remember this time. This time will be talked about as really important in the history of our country. Pah! That wasn't history, that was just politics. This now is history. A virus that has spread so quickly that over the last 5 months, it has impacted over 7 million people across the world, with over 400,000 deaths. In our country, this virus has killed more people than died in the Blitz in World War II, in half the time. This is history. This has changed the world forever. And then, in the midst of all this, in Minneapolis in America, the country most affected by the virus, a black man was arrested who had allegedly been trying to use a counterfeit note to buy cigarettes. He said he was claustrophobic and couldn't get into the police car, so he was forced to lie on the ground, and a police officer knelt on his neck. George Floyd called out for over 8 minutes that he couldn't breathe, and the officer was carried on kneeling, and eventually, as we all know, tragically, George Floyd died. And this may have been another shameful death in a country that at times has us scratching our heads why it should be the country where so many tragedies happen. But a 17-year-old student, Darnella Frazier, filmed it on her camera. And that video has become the straw that has broken the camel's back. So why am I, a white, middle-aged, middle-class vicar in a small rural Cheshire village, focusing my sermon, my talk on this? Why does it matter so much to me? What's it got to do with us? I didn't do it. Because by doing and saying nothing in the face of such injustice, no matter where it happens, we become complicit. You could say there's not a lot that unites the Anglican Church globally. We're always falling out over something. But there are 5 shared marks of mission that we have all signed up to. And number 4 says to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of any kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. Culturally, we're very different to the US. Thankfully, guns are not part of a way of our life, as they are in America. But that doesn't mean we're not still a huge part of that story that has led to the injustice of people being discriminated against for no other reason than the colour of their skin. And it sickens me, and it pains my soul. And so however uncomfortable this is to watch, to hear, I cannot stay silent. You'd have heard that our scripture was not, as it has been throughout lockdown, from the New Testament, mainly from the Gospels. This is Old Testament, and it's taken from one of the most important books in our Judeo-Christian heritage. It's Exodus, and it tells the story of the people of God. And in this passage, told to be a priestly kingdom, a holy nation, they will be God's most treasured possession. The people of Israel, who at the beginning of Exodus were slaves, kept in captivity until God intervened and freed them. And that heritage, that Judeo-Christian heritage, particularly the Christian part of it, underpins so much of the culture of our country today. It informs our laws, our ways of working, and the church is still an important institution. And yet the problem exists. You may remember that a few years ago, Scripture Union, the charity that I work for, introduced a new game for children, a video game called Guardians of Ancora, where you could play the stories of Jesus. This is the image of Jesus in the game. And I showed it to a friend of mine. And he said, "Why did you design it like that? That's not the image of Jesus that people are going to recognise." Well, strange as it sounds, Jesus wasn't a white man. Despite centuries of us portraying him as such, he certainly didn't have those piercing blue eyes of Robert Powell. In fact, none of the stories in the Bible are stories of white men or white women. I want us to think a little bit about the history of our country. And when we do, we think of those things that we can celebrate, things that we think have made us good. There's those battles we've won, Agincourt, Trafalgar, D-Day. And we also think about our great scientists and engineers, Newton, Watt, Stephenson, Brunel, Crick and Watson. But we tend to ignore the darker side of our history. And I think we can no longer ignore it. It should be a lens through which we see so much. I realise this is going to be a controversial statement, but honestly, throughout history, I cannot think of a nation that have been worse illegal immigrants than the British. And if we're being honest, what that means is the English. We just turned up to countries, we invited ourselves in, often using force, and then proceeded to take over every part of that country, calling it our own, establishing our ways of doing things. We said we owned the land and all the things on it, the resources, and in many cases, the peoples. We said we owned countries such as India, Pakistan, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Nigeria, Jamaica, Barbados, Egypt, Sudan. The list goes on and on. Our power, our wealth, our position globally, which we still benefit from today, came about because we took it from others that it belonged to. And because of that power and wealth, we came to see ourselves as superior. This is the right way to do things. It's the British way. It almost felt like we were God's favoured people. And I think most shamefully in that story, that sense of superiority meant that we saw those who weren't the same to be somehow less. And in the worst cases, they became our property that we could do with what we wanted. Our country was at the heart of the slave trade. And not only did we allow it, we positively encouraged it. We built monuments and statues, those things that are being argued about today, to those who made their money through it. Think of those great buildings in this country, those things that we think define our culture. And so many of them have been built with the profits of taking things from other countries where they belong to those people, and in the worst cases, taking the very people themselves. And I know we can point to church people who were instrumental in the abolition of the slave trade, most notably William Wilberforce. But we don't tend to hear about the stories where, when you were close to slave ports, churches who had grounds and often had garden parties, you were able to buy bracelets for your slaves. This was such an integral part of this country that when we did get to abolition, we didn't just free the slaves, we bought them back from the slave owners. A cost to us of the equivalent of £300 billion, which is estimated to be about 3 times what the coronavirus crisis is going to cost our country. It's a loan that we finally finished paying back 5 years ago. And even our Church of England got the equivalent of £500,000 for giving up slaves in the plantation that they partly owned. When I talk about seeing things through a different lens, I don't think we can really understand the impact that this has had on our society unless we listen to the voices of those people who have been most affected. Those countries that we walked into and took their resources, their people from centuries ago, those people started to come here 70, 80 years ago to contribute to our society, often invited, almost always legally. And if I'm honest, they're a really important and essential part of what makes me love this country so much. But they've come to a country that still has monuments to those people that cause them such pain and suffering. And we have to understand and acknowledge that. We have to think what those buildings and statues mean to those people. We have to listen not to the voices of white people like me and probably most of you watching, but those people who are here, whose ancestors were stolen from their land by the people we seem to celebrate and revere. The slogan of this movement is Black Lives Matter. The response I've heard to this more than any other is all lives matter. Of course they do. But we cannot get to a position where we can acknowledge all lives matter without doing more for those whose lives seem to matter least. We have to ask ourselves, is it better for us, the white people of this country, to have the heritage of those monuments that celebrate the slave trade and the way that we took and stole from other countries? Or is it better that our black, brown and other minority brothers see us start to understand what they really mean and the pain and hurt that they cause? In some ways, I hope that watching this has been a bit uncomfortable for you. It's been uncomfortable for me saying it. I prayed and thought a lot about whether I should say it. But we are going through a moment in history, and those moments we cannot remain silent. I don't believe that anyone would have chosen that two such important events coincide. But they do. And coronavirus cannot allow us to be deaf to the suffering of our black and brown brothers and sisters. And for those who are thinking, well, a lot of this is in the past, isn't it? The church is a lot better than it was. Let me share a message that was sent from one of our dioceses in the Church of England this year to a black ordinand who was seeking a curacy. His application was rejected without an interview because, and I quote, "The demographic of the parish is monochrome white working class, where you might feel uncomfortable."